Imagine you're driving on a dead straight road in the middle of the Colorado prairie. On both sides of the rust, golden brown grasslands stretch to the horizon. There are no car horns, no billboards, no human voices. There is only the wind blowing through the empty fields and the creak of a rusty sign swaying in front of an abandoned house. Then you see it, a town, or rather what's left of a town. The buildings stand still like skeletons. The streets, once bustling with people, now only have weeds growing through the cracks in the asphalt. And the question that echoes in your mind is, where did everyone go? Eastern Colorado isn't as famous as the majestic Rockies to the west. There are no snow-capped peaks, no vast pine forests, no expensive ski resorts. Instead, this is a flat, arid land where the sky is visible in every direction, unobstructed by any mountains. It is this seemingly monotonous landscape that holds a secret. Hidden in those vast open spaces are dozens of dead towns, communities that once lived and breathed and placed their hopes in this land, only to be swallowed by time and geography, leaving little trace. But the strange thing is, why did they die? And why did they die in the same way? If you look at a map of Colorado, you'll see a strangely clear division. The western part of the state is mountainous terrain, home to Denver, Colorado Springs, and other major cities. But the eastern part, bordering Kansas and Nebraska, is a vast high plateau called the Great Plains. This is the land where, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of people flocked with the dream of settling, farming, and building a future. They arrived on the railroads that were expanding westward. They pitched tents, dug wells, and ploughed the land. And from there, small towns began to spring up like mushrooms after the rain. But the geography of this land has its own rules, and those rules never show mercy to humans. Today we will journey through those towns together, not to visit as tourists, but to understand why they disappeared and what role geography played in each of their deaths. Our first stop is Keota in Weld County, northern Colorado. The name Keota comes from a Native American language, meaning the fire has gone out. From its very name, this place carried a sense of foreboding. The fire has gone out. Could it have been a prophecy? Keota was founded in 1880 when two sisters came here to settle and develop this land. They later sold it to the Lincoln Land and Cattle Company, and the town began to form around an important stop on the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad, which locals affectionately called the Old Prairie Dog Express. It was a charming nickname for a railroad that passed through a land where prairie dogs outnumbered people. At its peak, Keota never had more than 150 residents. It's an incredibly small number, but it was enough to form a community with a school, a post office, and close-knit neighbourly bonds. Then, the 1930s arrived like a nightmare. A severe drought ravaged the entire Great Plains. Not for just 1 year, not for just 2 years, but for a decade of almost continuous lack of rain. The land cracked, crops withered and died, and then the dust came. Massive dust storms, known as the Dust Bowl, rolled in like black walls, erasing everything in their path. Thousands of farming families across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado were forced to leave everything behind and move on. This wasn't a choice. It was a matter of survival. Keota, already tiny, couldn't withstand that devastation. By 1958, the population had dropped to just 15 people. And the last official resident left in 1999, the fire had gone out, just as the name had foretold. But this is only the beginning of the story. Not far from Keota is Hereford, Colorado, also in Weld County, which carries a similar but not identical history. Hereford was born in the late 1880s, initially as a railroad signal control station and a small depot on the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad. This wasn't a town built because someone loved the land. It was a town built because the train needed a place to stop. That means from the very beginning, Hereford's existence depended entirely on the railroad. When the railroad was active, the town had a reason to exist. When the railroad disappeared, the question of why anyone should stay here became harder to answer. The Great Depression hit Hereford just as brutally as it did Keota, Agriculture and ranching, the town's two economic pillars, collapsed along with global agricultural prices. The fields that were once a source of hope became a burden, and people began to leave, family by family, year by year, until all that remained were empty buildings staring at each other in silence. Hereford is located just a few miles from the Wyoming border, a geographical location that seemed advantageous but was actually on the fringe of everything, distant from all important economic centres. If you travel south on a map of Colorado, you'll find Model, a town on US, Highway 350, a road known as part of the historic Santa Fe Trail Byway, and also one of the most desolate roads in the entire state. The name Model was no accident. The town was developed in the early 20th century as a model of urban planning, an experiment in how to build a planned agricultural community. The idea sounded good and progressive at the time. Model once had everything a community needed to live. A post office, a grocery store, a school, a gas station. It was a miniature, self-sufficient universe, enough to sustain the lives of farming families in this remote land. But Model also suffered from the same disease as all the small towns in eastern Colorado. When large-scale corporate agriculture began to take over the land, when drought struck, when new highways were built that bypassed the town, Model no longer had a reason to exist in the old way. Freight trains still pass through Model every day, but they don't stop. That is perhaps the saddest metaphor for this place's fate. The world is still moving, but it moves on without needing to stop here anymore. Let's continue our journey to Arroyo, Colorado. The name Arroyo comes from the Spanish word arroyo, which means a small stream or a dry creek. This land was first settled in 1866 and later developed into a railroad camp when the Kansas Pacific Railroad line passed through between 1869 and 1870. Arroyo served as a watering station and a support point for railroad workers. It was a small, humble job, but it was enough to support a community. The most notable thing in Arroyo is the school. The school operated from around 1907 until the early 1960s. For over half a century, the children of this prairie learned to read, write, and do arithmetic within the four walls of that school. Then the school closed. Then the last families left. The last resident left Arroyo in 2002. A small stream can also run dry if no new water flows into it. But if you think these towns died only because of drought and economics, you've missed another layer of history. Let's go to Wild Horse, Colorado. This town began in 1869 as a US cavalry outpost. The site was once part of a frontier defense system, where soldiers guarded the land being settled to the west. As more settlers arrived, Wild Horse gradually transformed from a military base into a true civilian town. In its heyday, Wild Horse was a surprisingly vibrant place for its small size. It had a lumberyard, 3 saloons, a pool hall, a barbershop, a hardware store, and the majestic 2-story Albany Hotel. It sounds like a completely normal town with a future, but 1917 brought a disaster from which Wild Horse would never recover. A massive fire incinerated most of the town's commercial district. The flames didn't distinguish between important and unimportant buildings. They just burned everything. Then came the Great Depression, then the Dust Bowl, then the railroad left. Each blow was another nail in Wild Horse's coffin. Today, along the town's main road, every house is abandoned. Someone has made an effort to restore the old school, and the result looks impressive, like a final act of resistance against being forgotten. Continuing east, we arrive in Seibert, Colorado, in Kit Carson County. This is one of the more resilient towns compared to the others. The Seibert Post Office has been in continuous operation from 1888 to the present day, an incredible record in a land where everything tends to disappear over time. In 1920, at its peak, 311 people called Seibert home. The town's economy was sustained by agriculture and ranching, and something still keeps Seibert breathing. The railroad still passes through here, the grain elevators are still in operation, but Seibert's main street looks very different from how it did in the 1920s. Buildings that were once grocery stores, hardware stores, or even a music school now stands silent in a state of abandonment, with broken windows and caved-in roofs like defeated soldiers still standing but no longer fighting. Seibert's hotel, with its heavy wooden doors and long, dark corridors, must have witnessed countless stories of travellers over the decades. Not far from Seibert is Vona, Colorado. This town formed along the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad line when it reached this area in the late 1880s. And like many other towns on the plains, Vona's commercial district was destroyed by a major fire at some point in its history. It was a scenario that repeated so often it almost became a rule. Small towns in this prairie region tended to be ravaged by fire, as the buildings were mostly made of wood and the wind on the plains never stopped blowing. Once a fire started, nothing could stop it. In 1920, Vona had 268 residents. The post office is still in operation, but the decision to build the interstate highway to bypass the town was the fatal blow. When traffic no longer passed by the storefronts, those stores lost their reason to stay open. Vona slowly shrank, like a creature holding its breath. It's something to think about, the role of roads. Throughout the history of eastern Colorado, these towns lived and died by their transportation routes. First came the roads following old trade routes like the Santa Fe Trail. Then the railroad arrived and redrew the map of prosperity. The places on the rail line flourished. Those that were bypassed withered. Then the modern highway came and redrew the map once again. The towns lucky enough to be on the new route continued to exist. The towns bypassed by the highway lost their final lifeline. Geography, or rather human decisions about how to lay routes across that geography, decided the fate of each of these small communities. Stoneham, Colorado, in Weld County, was founded in 1888 and followed that same pattern. The town lost its rail service decades ago, and passenger rail service officially ended here in 1971. But Stoneham has something interesting. Its church seems to still hold services. The post office appears to still be active. On these remote prairies, the church and the post office are often the last thing standing after everything else is gone. They are the final anchors of the community, signs that someone is still here, that someone still wants to call this place home. Just outside Stoneham, along the highway, is an abandoned gas station and a cafe called the Prairie, now also deserted. The name Prairie seems like a historical irony. The prairie is still there, stretching on endlessly. Only the people are gone. Reimer, or as some call it, New Reimer, is the next stop on our journey. The town was originally platted in 1888 by the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad and officially incorporated in 1919. In the 1920s, Reimer was home to 417 people, a rather impressive number by plain standards. It had a bank, a grocery store and many other businesses. That bank, with its thick brick walls and heavy iron door, now stands in silence, like a safe that no one needs to open anymore. Reimer's grain elevators might still be in use, giant metal towers standing tall against the sky, the only remaining evidence that this land once supported so many families. There's an interesting detail in Reimer. Recently, someone has taken the trouble to restore a building in town. They did such a good job that it's hard to tell the building was ever dilapidated. It's a strange act in a place most people gave up on long ago. Someone still loves Reimer. Someone still believes there's something worth preserving here. And finally, we arrive in Delhi, Colorado, the last stop on today's journey. Delhi is located along Highway 350, right between the larger towns of Trinidad and La Junta. This is a seemingly advantageous location, situated on an important transportation artery. But a favourable location doesn't necessarily mean a favourable future. Delhi's general store, a building with a separate side room at the back, stands abandoned, its roof looking like it has recently partially collapsed. Time waits for no one, not even buildings. When passing through these ghost towns, there's a safety note to keep in mind. Abandoned structures always pose many dangers. The floors can be rotten, ceilings can collapse at any moment, and many buildings have signs warning against trespassing. We can admire from a distance, but we must respect those boundaries. Now, looking back on this whole journey, do you notice a pattern? Every ghost town in eastern Colorado died in one of a few familiar ways. The drought and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s were the biggest blow, devastating the region's entire agricultural economy for a decade. Then came the disappearance of the railroad, when rail companies closed unprofitable lines and the towns built around those stops lost their reason for being. Then came the shift in agriculture, as small family farms couldn't compete with large-scale industrial farming. And finally, there were the decisions about the highways when new routes were drawn on the map that bypassed many of the small towns that were already fragile. Each of those factors is related to geography in some way. The drought was a consequence of a geographical location in a region with low rainfall and a harsh climate. The railroads were laid along routes the terrain permitted, and towns that weren't in the right place were bypassed. Industrial agriculture thrives best on large, flat lands, precisely the kind of terrain in eastern Colorado, but it requires fewer workers, meaning fewer small communities could be sustained. And the highways were designed to serve large population centers, not the tiny towns scattered across the plains. The land of eastern Colorado looks simple from a distance. Just plains, just empty land, just sky. But hidden in that simplicity is a complex lesson about how geography shapes human destiny. The pioneers came here with dreams of a new land. They didn't know that the land here didn't get enough rain for sustainable farming. They didn't know that when the railroad decided to change its route, their entire town would die with it. They didn't know that what they built in this remote land would only exist for a brief moment in history. In truth, it wasn't their fault. Geography can't be blamed on people, and people can't be blamed for geography. It's just that the encounter between people and this land didn't end the way the pioneers had hoped. There's a strange thing about ghost towns. They don't disappear completely. The buildings are still standing, though dilapidated and decaying. The streets are still visible. The names on the map are still recorded. And sometimes, in towns that seem to be dead, a few people still hold on. In Keota, a single family still lives. In Cyber, the post office is still in operation. In Stoneham, the church is still open. And in Reimer, someone has just restored a building. Who are these people? They know they are living in places the world has forgotten, but they stay. Maybe because this is the land of their ancestors. Maybe because they love the absolute quiet of the vast prairie. Maybe because they simply have nowhere else to go. But their presence is a reminder that even when a town is economically and socially dead, it is still someone's home. Eastern Colorado, with its empty roads and lonely grain elevators standing tall on the plains, is not a place for everyone. But it has a beauty of its own, a beauty of vastness and silence, a beauty that you can only feel when you stand in the middle of that immense space and let the wind blow past you. The ghost towns here are not just relics of the past, they are questions about the future, about how we build communities, about how we understand the relationship between people and the land they choose to live on, about whether a place can ever truly die, or if it's just waiting for a new chance to be reborn. Today, those towns still stand silently on the map of eastern Colorado. The wind still blows through the empty window frames. The grass still grows through the cracked asphalt. And sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the sunlight casts a golden glow on the old brick walls, these towns look as if they are telling a story. The story of the people who came here with nothing but their hands and a dream. The story of the hard years that took away everything they had built. And the story of this great and unforgiving land, which remains still vast and challenging, whether people come or go. The history of the ghost towns in eastern Colorado reminds us that nothing is permanent, not even the communities that people poured their sweat and tears into building. Geography can offer opportunities, but geography can also take it all back if people don't understand its rules. And sometimes, despite all human effort, the land and the climate and distant economic decisions will decide a place's fate in a way that no one can prevent. What remains on the Colorado prairie is the silent but powerful evidence of all that. And that is why, even though these towns are dead, their story is still alive.